We affirm, and contention one is the other America. The greatest inequality in this country is between Native Americans who live on reservations and the rest of the population. Rob Caprosisco of Indian Country News calculated in 2000 that average on-reservation incomes are under $8,000, which is less than half the average income of an off-reservation American. The problem is that, as Harris of the Umatilla Indian Reservation reports in 2002, most Native American reservations have poorer infrastructure than do third world countries, and thus no access to job markets and opportunities for economic mobility. The solution to this form of inequality is to spend more on infrastructure. Keel of the National Congress of American Indians finds in 2011 that the primary barrier to on-reservation prosperity is a lack of transportation infrastructure. Contention two is disaster management. Natural disasters are becoming frighteningly likely. According to researcher Kelly Fareed, global warming has put the United States at extreme risk of hurricanes, and the fact that we haven't had a major storm in 9 years is a stroke of dumb luck. In fact, there is a 39 to 41% chance of the Gulf or Atlantic coast being hit by a Category 3 storm every single year. This is only a piece of the puzzle. Hill of Market Watch finds that an alarming 43% of U.S. homes are at high risk of some type of natural disaster, be it a hurricane, flood, tornado, or earthquake. We're not ready for this. Stockton of Wired finds that just about every coastal city in this country is completely unprepared for such a disaster. Investing in infrastructure resilience is the single best way to prevent natural disasters from destroying our cities. Weiss at the Center for American Progress finds that every $1 spent on resilience improvements saves the economy $4 from reduced damages. In fact, Stoltz of Missouri S&T University writes that if New Orleans levee infrastructure had been better funded, the destructive floods that came as a result of Hurricane Katrina could have been largely prevented. This is imperative because natural disasters dramatically increase inequality. Mazzozera of the University of Vermont finds that the impact of Katrina-like disasters is far more devastating for the poor, who lose their houses, jobs, and all hopes for mobility. Further, Costro of the CSIS finds that following a natural disaster, 30% of local small businesses shut down permanently. The impacts are long-term. Stockton continues that the economic effects of a natural disaster persist for up to 20 years. All in all, Miljakovic at North Dakota State University finds that for every $100 billion in hurricane damages, income inequality increases 5.4%. For context, Newman of the New York Times reports that Hurricane Sandy, which was just a Category 1 hurricane, cost $80 billion in damage, and Katrina cost $148 billion. Contention 3 is worker empowerment. Lucas Brunn of Duke finds in 2014 that if the federal government were to meet the DOT's funding requests, it would put 2.5 million Americans to work building and maintaining infrastructure. Not only are jobs created and people employed, but Florence Jamont of the IMF empirically finds that as public sector employment rises, so too does unionization as a way for workers to keep a check on their employers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics finds that 35 out of every 100 public sector workers joining the workforce will join a union. Comparatively, only 8% of private sector workers join unions. Increased participation in unions is critical for 3 reasons. First, increased political power. Keresi of UMass finds that unions catalyze collective political action, which is crucial to progressive policies that fight inequality. Keresi finds that unionized workers are 43% more likely to volunteer for an election campaign and 93% more likely to participate in protests than are non-unionized workers. Second is boosting wages. Walters of the EPI finds that unions both raise the wages of unionized workers 20% and set a pay standard for employers, increasing non-union wages by the same amount. Third is harming the rich. Hilaire of Think Progress finds that a decline in unionization over the past 30 years accounts half of the rise in the income of the rich. Overall, Bruno of Illinois finds that unions are the most effective institution of reducing inequality. A 10% increase in union membership reduces inequality between 4.7 and 14.5%. Thank you. Please affirm.
Because we agree with Harvard scholar William Wilson, it is impossible to close the income gap or ignore the geographical separation between poor America and rich America. Josh and I negate. We observe that the concentration of the poor in isolated neighborhoods is the most significant cause of income inequality because it entrenches existing wealth distribution in 2 ways. First, in public spheres, because the poor have far less political clout than the rich and generate less tax revenue to support local services. Catherine Kuhn of Michigan State University reports that that neighborhoods of concentrated poverty are neglected by the government in all areas, including police, fire, sanitation, health, and education. Second, in private spheres, concentrated poverty breeds stagnant local economies that fail to attract businesses and thus jobs. In fact, James Rosenbaum from Northwestern finds that just moving to a more affluent neighborhood increases the poor American's chance of employment by 25%. And if that weren't bad enough, here's the bar out of Emory writes that banks deny loans to residents of poor neighborhoods in an attempt to maintain profitability. This leaves the poor without any affordable loans they can use to make educational and entrepreneurial investments that would help them climb the economic ladder. When neighborhoods are segregated by income, it's easy for corporations and legislators to sideline the poor, making it functionally impossible to escape the vicious cycle of poverty. Integrating neighborhoods is the only way to establish an equal playing field. Contention 1 is housing. Project-based Section 8 vouchers are a form of means-tested welfare that provides low-income families with government-owned houses in more affluent neighborhoods, thus deconcentrating poverty. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities reports that 1.2 million families use these vouchers already, yet only 1 in 4 needy families have received them. Michael Johnson of Carnegie Mellon quantifies that these programs reduce concentrated poverty by at least 33%. But all of that goes way further, though. Monica Potts of the American Prospect finds that funding for Section 8 is on the chopping block this congressional season, so prioritizing infrastructure means Section 8 will certainly lose its head. Simply put, in an affirmative world, you cut Section 8 to spend on infrastructure, thereby entrenching concentrated poverty and leaving inequality to fester. Contention 2 is highways. Karen Rockford, the ACLU, finds that conversations about infrastructure routinely focus on highways. Even more concerning, Travis Madsen of the Frontier Group explains that the highway lobby is a powerful political force that directs money its way. This is why, according to Michael Grunwald of Time, 70% of the money in the last stimulus went to highways. When policymakers prioritize infrastructure, they spend on highways. Marlon Gornett of USC explains that since there are so many highways already, rather than creating economic activity, they redistribute it away from the neighborhoods that need it most, thus exacerbating poverty concentration. This occurs in 2 ways. First, by expediting urban blight. The noise, pollution, and crime generated by highways reduces the vitality of nearby neighborhoods. David Levin of Tufts finds that pollution from highways causes 80,000 deaths a year, while a report by the University of Albany explains that criminals look for locations near highways where there are many potential victims and easy escape. Cumulatively, these quality of life harms disincentivize people from living in or shopping near highways, thus relegating these neighborhoods to the impoverished. Mary Eagling of the University of Wisconsin-Madison finds that freeways lower property values and increase blight, which Hans Anderson of Auburn University finds increases poverty concentration. Second, by causing suburbanization. Highways create easier access to suburbs, allowing the wealthy to move outwards to bigger homes without sacrificing commute time, and leaving the poor, who can't afford to move, marooned in central cities. Nathaniel Baumsnow of Brown finds that adding 1 new highway to a city reduces its population by 18%. And because highways allow the rich to move out, Paul Jargowski of the University of Texas finds that suburbanization and poverty concentration are 2 sides of the same metropolitan process. You cannot build highways without segregating the poor. Overall, as a result of these 2 phenomena, Winston Riddick of Duke finds empirically that each additional highway running through a metropolitan area increases concentrated poverty. As Wilson said, there is no way to create a permanent solution to income inequality when poor America lives in segregated neighborhoods devoid of opportunity. Welfare will integrate neighborhoods. Infrastructure will only divide them.
Can I see the ventures with these poverty 32%?
Yes.
Can I see that?
Okay. As soon as everyone's ready.
Let's go. So mind if I ask the first question?
All yours.
Okay, so let's talk about highways.
Let's talk about it. What about?
Why do I have to advocate for construction of highways?
We say that the most likely thing that will happen and the vast majority of spending will go to highways.
Quick follow-up question.
Go for it.
Why do you get to choose the program you like?
Because we say that right now it's up for reconsideration. There's an expiration date on the program, and if we don't prioritize welfare now, it's not going to get refunded. Can I ask you a question? So in your second contention, you talk about disaster management. You talk about Christian freedom. So why was there such a disparate impact in Katrina?
One of the big reasons was that the levee infrastructure was in shambles, and they didn't have like proper seawalls
Why was
installed,
it-
so it was able to flood.
Why was there a disparate effect on poor people and rich people?
Because the poor people were unable to, recover as easily as the rich people. They go to the capital to get back on their feet. Can I answer your question?
Okay, because the poor neighborhoods don't have the capital to get back on their feet, right?
Poor people, I'd say, is the more important thing.
So like
We're talking about
FEMA, for example. Yeah, for sure. When FEMA went in, where did FEMA go? The poor neighborhoods or the rich neighborhoods?
the rich people didn't need that much help, so they went down. The poor people.
No, they went to the rich neighborhoods. The rich neighborhoods that were damaged by Hurricane Katrina got more help from FEMA.
From
Why?
FEMA, right? Sorry. So FEMA itself did go to the rich neighborhoods, but
Okay.
it sent the core into the poor neighborhoods. And there was assistance there. Can I answer
Okay,
your
so
question?
more help went to rich neighborhoods than poor neighborhoods. Why?
I guess because we're bad at helping people afterwards. But here's the
Yeah,
thing.
okay,
We
so-
shouldn't be in a position where we're helping people afterwards. Because if we strengthen our infrastructure, people won't need helping.
Right,
As a
either way,
result,
the
we're
issue
resisting
though
the natural
is that
disaster.
rich neighborhoods are better protected than poor neighborhoods. Do you have a question for me?
Yeah, I do. So let's talk a little bit more about this chopping law.
Mhm.
Okay. So if the judge doesn't vote affirmative, how can you assure them that it doesn't get chopped anyways?
Well, first, I would say if you want to vote for welfare, the best way to vote for welfare is to vote for the negative.
But you don't advocate.
But
that. You
second-
advocate one program.
The likelihood, like this right now is up for refunding for another like tenure of like a good amount of years. I don't know exactly how many. But if we prioritize it right now, then we refund it for another long series of
Do you have
years.
a card that says infrastructure trades off with this?
We have a card that says if we don't prioritize it, it's going to get cut. But I have a lot of cards I can show you about topicality for that. Can I ask you a question?
You can.
In your third contention, you talk about unions. So who participates in unions for the most part?
Workers, especially construction.
Okay, and where are they? Like in terms of if we do like an income bracket, where do you put them? Yeah, so they're not right at the bottom. So what happens to the people at the bottom?
I mean, I'd say those people are poor. But if you take these people, you lift them up, you still reducing inequality. And moreover, I
So
would add that the unions are increase.
Yeah.
You see that overall there's an increase in political mobilization, and those policies implemented by progressive politicians would reduce the gap.
how do unions make sure that they're making money? They exclude people who aren't in unions,
It
right?
doesn't matter because they help
So
out.
that's the point.
No, this is the pay because they set a pay standard across the entire industry. That's why Walters finds they increase not only their income 20%, but everyone else's too. Don't let it be in your
It's going to just be an overview to their case, and then case. And also response to their framework. I'll look at framework first, then their case. Is everybody ready? So they say the most important thing is geographic separation. I'd say just look holistically, look to overall impacts, and we can lay them at the end of the round. As Bruno argues, probably unions are the bigger and most important thing for income inequality, so we can lay that. But the first thing they tell you is Section 8 housing vouchers. Oh, sorry. The overview is that means-tested welfare spending doesn't last into the long term. That's Corky of the Institute for Social Research, who finds that giving money to the poor polarizes the rest of the population such that they form coalitions against welfare spending and vote in anti-welfare candidates. Consequently, the overall welfare budget shrinks in the long term. Infrastructure doesn't have this problem. It continues there, but in the long term, you lose all the welfare benefits because of this problem. A great example was the Great Society right after you saw the rise of conservatism. That's what happens. Their first contention, they talk about housing vouchers. The first thing to keep in mind is that their study is from 2005. It says, quote, this could be effective. But I'm going to give you some reasons that it empirically hasn't been effective, so their hypothetical study doesn't matter. First, because vouchers reconcentrate poverty. The scope of the NHI finds that vouchers tend to move poor families from one poor neighborhood to another one, which can destabilize the family and even drive out middle-class neighborhoods, turning the area into a slum, which they say is really bad. Second, government housing vouchers consistently fail. That's Johns Hopkins in 2013. They're failing all the time because they're not helping the poor. And fourth, Sentinels of the Atlantic in 2015, this year, who concurs, vouchers are ineffective. There's a reason they're on the chopping block. There's a reason that they're not getting federal funding. And when it comes down to it, there's a reason that they're going to be cut. They're not effective in the status quo. Plus, it's just one program that they're advocating for. There's no guarantee that they get that program if you go con. Go to their second contention where they talk about infrastructure harms. A lot of responses here. The first is an overall response. It's that infrastructure overall, if you look at overall infrastructure, it actually reduces inequality. And that's because it creates jobs and helps the poor access jobs. The first study to look to is Gibson of Georgia State, who performed a very recent analysis, found infrastructure significantly reduces inequality and sharply increases the amount of wealth in the hands of the poor. It's because they get more jobs and access to better jobs. Second is Calderon and Chong in 2001, looked at 35 years of data, used a lot of econometric infrastructure methods. They find overall infrastructure is decreasing inequality. Maybe the one area of infrastructure that they like to talk about is increasing it, but I'm going to tell you why that's not true either. The second response is that overall, we're able to help the poor access jobs with infrastructure, and that's because, as the PTT explains, transit infrastructure frees up land that would be used otherwise for parking lots and transit lanes, allowing cities to be more compact. That's important because, and King Sue quantifies every 1% increase in infrastructure spending makes it more compact by 0.1%. It's important because Helen Mountford of the World Resources Institute finds every 10% increase in the compactness of a city makes Americans 4.1% more likely to climb from the lowest income to the highest income bracket because they get more job opportunities. At that point, you see that when it comes down to infrastructure, you're helping the poor in the cities. But now let's talk a little bit about the impacts that they give you. The biggest thing to keep in mind is where in New York are we building these highways? They never tell you that we're building the highways in the city in the status quo, right? They need to show you that in the status quo, most of these highways are going to the city and that they push the poor out. Otherwise, I just can't see where we're building this highway in the city and pushing the poor out. It would also be great if they gave some examples of this happening. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to see and very hard to weigh. But now, in terms of how you do weigh it, right? They tell you that the concentration of poverty is really bad. I would tell you that overall, helping the poor not only access jobs, but have higher quality jobs is far more important. And that comes from the union's contention that we give you. It's because when it comes down to it, when the poor are able to access jobs, even if it's not just the poorest people, it sets a pay standard, as Malcolm was alluding to in Crossfire, that helps all people in the area because it says, this is what you should be paying, and other companies do the same. At that point, that's going to help the poor far, far more. But another thing to keep in mind is you can use our second contention as a prerequisite to their last contention, or it's pretty much their entire case. Because when it comes down to it, I don't care how nice your housing is. If you get hit by a tornado or a hurricane, it doesn't matter. And so the biggest thing to keep in mind is that A, our case is a prerequisite to theirs. B, vouchers reconcentrate poverty. And C, when it comes down to it, infrastructure has empirically reduced inequality.
Actually, sorry, before Josh's rebuttal, can I see scope and top?
It's already. So, starting off with two general overviews on today's round. First, because the most educational way to have a debate round is to look at what would actually happen in the real world if we were to affirm the resolution. We should analyze the specific infrastructure programs to be most likely to be prioritized in an affirmative world. Our opponents can't just pick and choose infrastructure programs out of a hat, which is really important because in my opponent's rebuttal, he completely drops the Rocker analysis that the conversations around infrastructure right now routinely focus on highways, and then it also drops the Grunwald analysis, which says the last time we prioritized infrastructure, which was during Obama's stimulus, 70% of the money went to highways. At that point, my opponent's first and second contentions can just be dropped completely out of the round because they're not possible. When we prioritize infrastructure, we're going to be spending it on highways, not these other things we're talking about. But second, concentrated poverty is going to be the most important impact of today's round. My opponents respond to this framework by saying that we should look holistically. What we're saying is that when you do look holistically at income inequality, the best way to solve income inequality is to reduce concentrated poverty. The analysis comes from Williams, we bring up in our case, who explains that solving for concentrated poverty is a prerequisite for having any sort of income mobility, because when the poor are trapped in neighborhoods that are neglected by the government, that don't have any social services, that don't have any jobs, that have stagnant economies, they cannot rise up, and income mobility becomes almost impossible. The best way to solve for income inequality is to solve for concentrated poverty. Now moving on to my opponent's case. So first is to talk about funding for transportation infrastructure at Native American reservations. First of all, my opponents give no justification for why this would actually occur. Right now, the federal government neglects Native American reservations. Even if they were to prioritize infrastructure spending, my opponents don't tell you why they would specifically go to Native Americans. My opponents can fiat that infrastructure spending will happen, but they can't fiat that there will be a paradigm shift in the way that the federal government approaches infrastructure spending. But second, what Sean Reagan of Forbes explains is that specifically on Native American reservations, federal spending actually does more harm than good, because the federal government approaches these reservations with a very paternalistic attitude. They don't take into account the reservations' actual needs, and they just ruin these reservations. Now moving on to my opponent's second contention about disaster management. Once again, the first response that they give no reason why this would be prioritized. More than half of our Congress doesn't even believe in global warming itself, much less believe in policies to mitigate the effects of global warming. But second, my opponents don't say specifically, A, what kinds of infrastructure would solve for rising sea levels, and B, my opponents don't say specifically what kind of infrastructure would solve for rising sea levels. What Onishi of the New York Times explains is that the kind of infrastructure that we do look to now, like seawalls, is actually completely ineffective. For example, seawalls in Japan totally failed to stop the tsunami that ruined almost all, that had incredibly harmful effect on Japan's economy. What he does find is that instead these seawalls just inspire a false sense of confidence that encourage people to live near seas. At the end of the day, what we have to accept is that global warming is happening. We have to instead not have this false sense of confidence and just move away from the coastline. Now moving on to my opponent's third contention about worker empowerment and unions. The first response is recognize that all of their impacts here are short-term, because the infrastructure jobs only last until the highway is done being built, and then these workers don't have a job anymore. So the increase in union membership is solely short-term. There are no long-term impacts from this contention. But second, my opponents don't actually tell you the impact because they don't quantify what the increase in union membership is and what the impacts of that increase are. But now moving on to their three specific impacts. First, they say that unions advocate for good policies that will help the poor. What Dimitri Melvin of the Daily Beast explains is that because unions now are primarily made up of middle-class workers, they often advocate for policies that are actually anti-poor, not pro-poor. For example, unions have made it nearly impossible to remove ineffective teachers, which has harmed the public education system that the poor rely on, and unions have also driven mass incarceration policies because for example, corrections workers are unionized, they drive mass incarceration policies that harm the poor. Then my opponents say that wages will increase. What we're saying is that these wages are going primarily to middle-class union workers. They're not going to the poorest of the poor. The way to help the poorest of the poor is to deconcentrate poverty, not to employ middle-class people in construction jobs. But finally, my opponents say that unions are good because they harm the rich. They never tell you why unions harm the rich, and they never tell you why this is uniquely a good thing. I would argue that the best thing to do, instead of harming the rich, is to help the poor, is to deconcentrate poverty, is to bring people into neighborhoods where they actually have opportunity. That's why I strongly urge a negative balance. Are you ready for cross?
Yeah, you guys have both computers back. I enjoy feeling powerful. That one's mine.
Oh, that's yours.
Great. So, in terms of my last contention, you tell me essentially that these unions are driving mass incarceration. How much and why?
I mean, I can't quantify how much more mass incarceration there is. But basically, what I explained is that prison workers are unionized, so unions fight for policies that increase employment for prisoners.
You have one type of union that you say is
But the thing is that unions join together to fight for one another. So if one union is strengthened, it strengthens all unions.
Why don't we more direct link to inequality, which is just through like wages and through higher
But we're telling you that these wages go to the middle class, and the thing we have to focus on is helping the poor. But
because we tell you, let's just finish on this. Because what we tell you is it sets a base standard in the industry which will help the poor as well. Do you have a question for me?
Of course. Okay, so you tell me at the beginning of your rebuttal that you give this overview. You say that because anti-welfare candidates are elected, every time we increase welfare spending, in the long run we actually decrease welfare spending by more than we increase it, right? Okay, so then why is welfare spending not negative?
I don't think it ends up being. I mean, it doesn't become negative. It just doesn't stay in the long term. And the great example is the Great Society. Right after the Great Society, you saw huge welfare cuts with
right. So like I like math, right? Mathematically, if every time you increase something in the end you decrease it by more than you increase it, then you're going to end up with a negative
I'm just
number.
saying it's by a comparable
Wait, no, but if it's by a comparable amount, then you end up with 0, right? If every time you increase something, you decrease, but we have welfare right now.
No,
So if your argument is true, then the world would look very different from the way it actually
My
looks.
argument is it doesn't. So maybe you get some impacts. It's just a lot of them don't manifest in the long term.
So you're saying that welfare isn't good because not all of it will end up being given
It's
to
a
people.
weighing argument. It's not saying that welfare isn't good. It's just telling you infrastructure, all of it stays in the long term. A lot of welfare gets cut back.
All of the infrastructure stays in the long term.
There's no reason it wouldn't. It's like
The infrastructure can deteriorate. I mean, we spend money on
that's
maintenance
fine,
for a
right?
reason.
Like that's fine. It can deteriorate. I'm just saying the spending continues.
Okay, you ask me.
Alright, so why don't we, can you give me an example of a highway, sorry, where's your school again?
It's in Manhattan.
Okay, give me an example of a highway that was built in New York recently.
Well, there's no room to build anything
I
in New
know,
York,
that's
right?
my argument.
But we're we're not talking about New York, right? So we're talking about cities in general. So for example, right now there are major highway projects happening in Detroit and Denver. We can give you evidence that this is happening, but that's just one example of the larger.
But I don't know that is an example of a larger picture, right? Because when it comes down to it, your entire argument relies on the fact that we can just like shove a highway into this area. And maybe there are some like projects in these couple of cities, but you tell me 70% is highway construction.
The
don't say 70% is highway construction in cities. What percent is in cities?
It doesn't even matter if the highways necessarily are in the cities. The point is
Well,
that
it does,
highways
exactly,
make it A, easier to live in the suburbs, by making it easier to move around the suburbs, but B, even if the highways aren't in the cities themselves, they connect the cities to the suburbs.
Can't I live in a suburb if I already have if I have like one highway and another one that's like this? Like,
I mean, okay, so guys, our point is that on average, these highways cause suburbanization. We give you the evidence. They decrease the population of the city on average by 18%, right? That causes suburbanization, and that's really bad for them.
Starting now.
I'm sorry, actually, before you guys do that, can I see the exact part of the title of the CCU? Is that like
Cool. Starting from. I said all set. 5 seconds. Is everyone ready? The order will make sense, but I'm going to start on here. So starting now. So first on vouchers, a few things to keep in mind. Remember the SWOT evidence and reads, which tells you that these vouchers only reconcentrate poverty. They pay for everyone to the same kinds of public housing and private housing that the vouchers give people rent for. So you're just turning vertical ghettos into horizontal ghettos because you're moving the poor people into a building of again all poor people because that's the publicly owned housing. You're reconcentrating poverty. They have noted that. But now go to the overview that Ben gives. This is the first way you vote for us, which is only what happens in the long term. Corby tells you that because of political backlash from the rich and middle class, they form political coalitions against welfare spending, which means that welfare spending is essentially sinful and just gets rolled back. He asked them, why is there spending now? That's because we're on one side of the cycle. If you increase spending, then we're going to get to the other side of the cycle, and welfare spending will get rolled back. They have no long-term impacts. And that's a weighing argument. Because the Gibson and Calderon evidence that Ben puts on their second contention tells you that in the long-term infrastructure, like highways, gives increased access to jobs, which overall reduce inequality. You can sign a ballot right there. But the second voting issue is going to be concentrated poverty. This is our first contention. Because the single most concentrated locations of poverty are Native American reservations. We tell you that average on-reservation income is less than half of average off-reservation income. So in terms of magnitude, it's the most important form of inequality in today's round. They tell you that why would we spend on that? First, because there's a lot of inequality there. And second, because he justifies that 70% of spending is highways. We just put those highways on reservations. At that point, we're fitting into his hospitality burden. And then he tells you that spending is paternalistic. But not in the case of infrastructure spending on Native American reservations, because McCaleb tells you that most of it is administered through self-determination funds, which actually support tribal sovereignty. So you can sign a ballot right there, because at the end of the day, we're remedying the most morally important form of inequality and the most magnitudely strong form of inequality. But the last voting issue is going to be our third contention, where we talk about labor unions and increasing workers, and they don't contest the labor. When there's more workers, ultimately you're going to see more unionization. They just say it's short term. But Broad actually finds that these jobs are in the long term because they're in stuff like maintenance, so you have to repaint the highway. So in the long term, you see an increased unionization, which is really important because Bruno tells you that unions are the most important effective institution in reducing inequality, because a 10% increase in union membership reduces inequality 14.5% because they set a pay standard across the entire industry and increase everybody's wages. A rising tide lifts all ships.
Cool. We will run a little bit. Starting off on framework, Josh and I have told you throughout this read that solving for concentrated poverty is a prerequisite to alleviate income inequality. It makes sense. The rich and rich neighborhoods have access to a lot of services, so they move up, and the poor don't, so they move down. My opponent's only response to this is that we have to look to unions instead because they'll provide jobs for people, but that doesn't really make sense, right? In their world, the poor go to work and then they come back home to super poor neighborhoods that are super far away, and the reality is that it's really hard for them to be able to get work when it's so far away. And just building infrastructure doesn't solve for that because you can't use a highway if you can't afford a car. Rosenbaum finds that on net employment increases 25% when poor people move to more affluent neighborhoods. That's the best way for them to access jobs. Very briefly in my opponent's case first, they tell us that we're going to end up decreasing welfare in the future. But as Josh has told you in Crossfire, welfare has been increasing for 50 years, and we haven't seen it be cut dramatically yet. They give us no break. They give us no reason why this is actually going to happen, and whether it's actually going to be housing vouchers that are cut. But next, my opponents talk about reservations, but they don't respond to the topicality argument Josh puts on it, which is that the federal government has very rarely prioritized spending for Native Americans. There's no reason to believe that if we prioritize infrastructure, it goes to Native Americans. Now, here's where you vote for the net in today's round, and that's off of housing. We tell you that project-based Section 8 vouchers will be cut, and we need to prioritize welfare to fund them. There's a difference between project-based Section 8 vouchers and tenant-based Section 8 vouchers. Tenant-based vouchers are owned by private landlords project-based Section 8 vouchers or one or two family homes in more affluent neighborhoods owned by the government. My opponents put their first three response to the Swope, Hopkins, and Samuels evidence is all about tenant-based, not project-based, which is what we're advocating for. They say it's ineffective because these landlords aren't taking vouchers. The government will take vouchers because they don't care about their profit margin. So all of our evidence flows through. Hartley of the Cleveland Fed finds that empirically, voucher recipients had a 40% decrease in their neighborhood poverty rate when they use these project-based Section 8 vouchers. Lastly, my opponents say that it's not topical because it's not going to be cut or going to be augmented, but we show you the cost evidence which says that it's up for reconsideration. We need to prioritize infrastructure to make sure it's funded. At the end of the day, the Johnson analysis is the most important piece of evidence in the round because it finds that on our side, we decrease concentrated poverty by at least 33%. In the worst case scenario, you decrease concentrated poverty by 33% by voting for the negative.
I made this sort of thing. You just said the prerequisite, voucher is like just being the biggest magnitude. Like, how do we weigh this?
What do you mean?
Like, I'm your framework. How are we weighing concentrated poverty?
I mean, Wilson says it's a prerequisite.
Okay, so like, in terms of actual inequality on the ground, how does reducing concentrated
Yeah,
poverty change?
because you cannot achieve income equality when people live in neighborhoods where they have no opportunity. If the poor cannot move up, then in the long term, we're not talking about full equality. We're talking about if the poor are trapped in these neighborhoods that are poverty traps, there will be income inequality will not go down by any significant margin. The best way to decrease income inequality is to decrease concentrated
We can
poverty.
show you that by doing something else, we're reducing inequality by like a substantial margin. Can't the judges still vote for us?
No, because it's not long term. So what Wilson finds is that the only way to alleviate income inequality in the long term is to reduce concentrated poverty, which makes sense. Can I finish? Awesome. Okay. So the thing is, right now in more affluent neighborhoods, there are better jobs, better access to banking and credit, better public services. You have it.
Wait, so
But can I finish? Sorry. So when you guys talk about jobs, like sure, there might be some jobs poor people might be able to get them, but then they keep having to travel home like very far distances. They go home to these poor neighborhoods where they don't have good schools, where they don't have access to credit. Like they're completely discriminated on the basis of where they
in
live.
terms of how you access this,
Yeah.
so you don't extend it. Did I miss it? Or did you not?
I didn't
We've
make
not.
sense.
So it's just because you mentioned that you access
Yes.
this. Okay. Just finish off on this. You say we're advocating a different type of voucher. How often is that different type of voucher being used?
Just as
Tenant
often.
based and
Just as
project based.
often.
Project
That-
based.
that's-
1.2 million families have project based. 2 million families have tenant based.
So but how is the warrant different, right?
Okay. Yeah. Let me
The
explain.
warrant, let me explain that, Smith.
Okay.
I want to make sure you're answering the right thing, right? Because the warrant is that the government's paying to move all of these people into a specified unit. And if you move them all into the same unit, you're just taking the community and putting it
It's not
inside of
moving
it.
everyone.
Okay, yeah, so here's the thing. Project-based Section 8 vouchers are also not like the projects as we traditionally conceptualize them, right? So it's not moving everyone into one unit.
It's not
It's moving
top.
families into one or two family households in relatively more affluent neighborhoods. And the reason why project-based Section 8 is different from tenant-based Section 8 is because, as you guys say, landlords with tenant-based Section 8 will probably refuse vouchers because it doesn't make sense for them. They don't make as much money. But the government doesn't have those same incentives, so they're going to put these project-based Section 8 houses in more affluent neighborhoods, and they're going to accept low-income
And
families.
your reason to negate is that they'll get cut, right? Like, they'll get cut. Your reason to negate is that you'll get cut.
Yeah, there's also
Right. Do you have a question for us?
okay, there's also
Also, they should be expanded.
right.
They're two, right?
there's
They're-
also
they're-
impetus
they're both
for
sides
them
of the same coin.
to be
but
upward.
your problem is they're getting cut.
Well, the problem is that they're getting cut, and the best thing that could happen is if they're
So
augmented.
if they get cut, it's bad, right?
If they get cut, it's bad. If they get expanded,
Did you say it's a new program or?
it's
No,
not
they're
a-
not.
Can I just see the distribution?
Yeah, we're playing. Sorry. We'll get it for you. Sorry about that.
Oh yeah. Okay. You have the one.
Just thinking a little bit about vouchers. So when it comes to vouchers, right? First off, is he really advocating different types of vouchers? But when it comes down to it, like in cross, it sounds like they're saying there's both types of vouchers, right? If we're saying that one type of voucher is bad and they say one is good, it's like pretty clear, like that you don't really vote for anybody, right? The scope evidence tells you that the type that we're saying exists, they both exist, reconcentrate poverty. They say those are beneficial, but those are like, one is beneficial, one reconcentrates poverty. Altogether, it doesn't actually give you a benefit. But the final response to this is you look to our overview from Corpy. In the long term, these programs get rolled back because of the political harm. At that point, they don't really act as any offense. If you give us like anything can move us around, any benefit from infrastructure is enough to move us around because they don't get any benefits from welfare. The first reason you vote for us, like at that point, is the Gibson and Calderon evidence that just like give you empirics that tell you that there's an increase in jobs, an increase in job access, that's the warrant, and they tell you that's why infrastructure has reduced inequality. No response from them the entire round, just like the empirics, the overall infrastructure is reducing inequality, that's enough to vote for us, even though it sounds kind of flippy. But the second reason to vote for us is often concentrated poverty, where they talk about, it's really important. Their framework is like, look to the most concentrated poverty. That's Native American reservations, so we access their framework. Furthermore, look to the fact that the highways they talk about are the way to help Native Americans, and McCaleb tells you these programs exist right now, they just don't get enough funding. That's important because these are the most marginalized people in the entire country, and it's important because these people have no chance of accessibility to long-term jobs, no chance of getting out of like this extreme poverty if they don't have this opportunity to have long-term success through having roads to get jobs. The third reason you vote for us is off of unions. And it's because they never contest the warrant, right? Run tells you have more people working in the long term because you have to maintain roads as well. 2.47 million more people working, and 36 of every 100 are working in unions as well because it's a public sector job. It's important because A, it boosts wages by 20% for not only the workers but the entire sector because it sets a pay standard. B, it hurts the rich as well because the workers keep the rich in check through things like strikes. And then the ultimate evidence comes from Bruno. A 10% increase in unionization reduces inequality by 14.5%. I think that outweighs the possible benefits they maybe get from Section 8 vouchers. Thank you.
How much prep do we have remaining?
Like 20 something seconds.
Oh, great. Okay.
So, starting off on the issue of framework, what we've been saying throughout this entire round is that the issue of concentrated poverty is the most important because when people live in concentrated poverty, this is the Williams evidence, they lack access to opportunities, they lack access to good jobs, to good schools, to so many other good institutions that are necessary for upwards economic mobility, which is why the Williams evidence says that solving for concentrated poverty is a prerequisite to solving core income inequality. My opponents don't respond to this in either their summary or their final focus at this point. This framework goes conceded in today's round. You're going to be only weighing arguments under this framework. You can drop the union's argument right there. But now, this might also be kind of flippy, but only weigh empirics if they're warranted. Don't just vote for them because they have some statistics that agree with them. But finally, moving on to this point about Native American reservations, they completely dropped our topic response in Keeley that I brought in my rebuttal in Keeley. Senate through in her summary, the federal government neglects Native American reservations. We prioritize infrastructure. It would not be going to Native Americans. You can drop that argument right there. But now moving on to the major issue of today's round, which is the issue of housing. My opponent gets up here in his final focus and he says that if one type of Section 8 is bad and one type of Section 8 is good, then on net, it just cancels out. But the reason why we're talking about project-based Section 8 is because project-based Section 8 is the form of welfare that is on the tipping point right now. It's specifically about project-based Section 8. We're not talking about increasing the other kind of Section 8. We're saying if we prioritize welfare, we're increasing project-based Section 8, which is really, really good. We explained that on average, with project-based Section 8, people move into neighborhoods that are 40% less poor, and the net effect of that, according to the Johnson evidence, which my opponents never contest in the entire round, is that there's a decrease in concentrated poverty of 33%. At the end of the day, my opponents give you all these arguments about access to jobs. They say that unions increase wages for jobs and transportation infrastructure makes it easier to get there. Well, we give you the Rosenbaum analysis that says that just moving to a richer neighborhood increases the likelihood of employment by 25% because wealthy neighborhoods are where the jobs are. And moreover, if the poor don't have, like transportation infrastructure is far less effective at getting jobs. If the really poor don't have cars, they can't use highways to get to a job. At the end of the day, we're the only ones who link into the framework of concentrated poverty. We're telling you that we need to vote for the negative to deconcentrate poverty in the United States. That's why I urge a negative vote.